Hey everybody, what's going on? And welcome to Guns N' Roses Central. And I want to talk about something that was in the news lately, and it's kind of a creepy Chris Cornell story. I told you guys about this because our buddy Kevin went to go see Duff at the Grammy Museum on April 4th, and Duff apparently told the story, but I didn't have the exact quote. But now it's finally come to light as I think it was Blabbermouth published what Duff had said at that performance. He basically played a bunch of songs off his new record, but then he also told stories in between. And he told a story about Chris Cornell and how at least one of the songs off his record is inspired by Scott Weiland, Chris Cornell, and Chester Bennington. And Duff said, when I met Shooter, Duff said, so Shooter was his producer and the backing band he's going to be using, so it'll be Shooter Jennings' backing band. He said, I had these chords and all I had was feel. When the lights go down, you're still there. All you hoped here remains. And it was coming from Scott Weiland, who I worked with and really tried to help a few times, intensely. One time, like going to the Cascade Mountains for a month, intensely, and just saw that it just took him over. Then he talked a bit about Chris Cornell and said, then Chris Cornell, Susan, who was Duff's wife, and Susan Silver, who was Chris Cornell's first wife, were pregnant at the same time. They had their daughters 2 weeks apart, and we hung out with them and our babies. That's just real life shit. And then Chris going, the effing weird thing about it is that night, about 8 o'clock at night, Axl came into rehearsal and said, let's do Black Hole Sun. Let's try that song. We rehearsed it until 12:30 that night. I got home and GN'R guitarist Richard Fortas texted me and told me that Chris Cornell passed away. So that's pretty creepy and coincidental. It kind of reminds me of, me being a big Howard Stern fan. Robin Williams passed away a couple of years ago, and Howard told a story of how he felt bad about this one interview he did with Robin Williams back in like the late 80s, early 90s. Howard thought he was disrespectful to Robin Williams and said he should reach out to him and maybe see if he can come on the show again and do a proper interview. And he had that discussion with his wife, and his wife told him like later that day that, oh, he passed away. So it's really coincidental. I'd always thought they did Black Hole Sun as a reaction to Chris Cornell's death and as a way to honor him. Now, Chris Cornell and the guys from Guns N' Roses have a long history together. In fact, at one point it was rumored that a variety of high-profile musicians would be replacing Scott Weiland in Velvet Revolver. And some of these musicians included, of course, Chris Cornell, Ian Astbury of The Cult, Corey Taylor of Slipknot, and even before Velvet Revolver, there was rumors like Chris Cornell was going to front Slash's Snake Pit, at least the 2000 incarnation of it. So Slash addressed the rumors that Chris Cornell was set to join Velvet Revolver as a lead singer. He said, the interviewer asked, there's an internet rumor going around that you were going to put together a band with Chris Cornell around then. And Slash said, I didn't know if that ever was a reality. I didn't even know that was a rumor. I did work with Chris on my solo record, but I never had any prospects of doing a band with him. So that is true. Slash did work with Chris Cornell in 2010 on his solo record on the song Promise, which I think is one of the better songs off the record. And here's what Slash had to say about collaborating with Cornell in 2010. He said, Chris was great, and Promise was probably the most unorthodox piece of music that I'd written. It was very different. It was one of those things, I don't know why I thought of him for that song more than any of the others, but I sent it to him, and within 48 hours he sent me this great lyric, and we were off and running. And it was as simple as that, and everybody seems to like this one. Now, Chris Cornell, of course, toured with Soundgarden. He was the frontman of Soundgarden, and they opened for Guns N' Roses in 1992. And here's what he had to say about Slash himself. He said, I met Slash in 1992 when GN'R took Soundgarden on tour. He was extremely gracious and always very supportive. Often when you tour with a band that's extremely successful, they treat you like shit. Slash was always a very consistent and amicable person, and is now. And I will say this, and I don't mean this as a slight to him, it's actually a compliment. Slash is the most drunk guitarist I've ever seen play well on stage. I was never able to be that trashed and be good at the same time, and that's part of his consistency. He doesn't drink now, and he's still great. That dedication to music is what drives his character. Now, that wasn't the only time that Chris Cornell talked about touring with Guns N' Roses when he was in Soundgarden. He did talk a bit about Axl. He said, without saying anything negative about Axl Rose, what I remember the most was Duff and Slash and everyone else being regular, sweet, warm guys in a rock band that just wanted to play rock music, recalls Cornell. And then there was like this Wizard of Oz character behind the curtain that seemed to complicate what was the most ideal situation they could have ever been in. They were the most successful and famous rock band on the planet. Every single show, hundreds of thousands of fans just wanted to hear songs, and for some reason there seemed to be this obstacle in just going out and participating in that. That's what I remember the most, and it's sad, he said. Now, Soundgarden looked back on their European tour. They opened some shows early in '92 for Guns in the States, and then they also opened up a number of the European shows in the summer of '92. And Soundgarden looked back on their European slot, opening for Guns N' Roses with admiration, but also a sense of caution. So Ben Shepherd would go on to say that he wanted to hate the circus that had become the Use Your Illusion tour, but he couldn't hate it because the guys in the band and their crew were just too nice. And though Cornell commented decades later that everything was fine, in particular Slash and Duff were cool to hang around with, but he said that Axl could make things difficult. And Matt Cameron said that the band had to do this tour in order to get on Lollapalooza in 1992 and to make a name for themselves. Another thing that Chris Cornell pointed out in an interview I'm about to play you is how a lot of Axl's handlers would, create rules for the bands who would be supporting Guns N' Roses and for the people around the band that maybe even Axl himself didn't know about, and it could sometimes reflect poorly on Axl.
I actually believe that grunge, if you want to refer to it as a genre like that, I think Guns N' Roses was one of the bands that really paved the way. I think that they were sort of the new school at their time. Like suddenly these guys come out and they're wearing dirty jeans and Jack Daniels T-shirts, and their songs are nastier. The singer's crazy. He's kind of scary looking. He's not really pretty. The guitar player, you can never see his eyes. They were one of the bands that kind of broke that open a little bit, where radio stations, magazines, MTV took a chance and said, well, we're going to play this. It's like not what we're used to. And that was a stepping stone to other bands, to bands like Faith No More, the Red Hot Chili Peppers, and then Soundgarden, and then Pearl Jam and Nirvana. I feel like they were kind of along the way. The thing was that the timing did take them from, okay, we're just kind of a filthy rock band in Hollywood, now we're successful. It took them to stadiums with giant inflatable things and two keyboard players and background singer and big. They sort of slipped into what the old school thing was live, kind of. But still, I mean, they were definitely new, and they didn't go away. I mean, I think they themselves sort of created a situation where they went away because they're not making records. But they didn't lose their fans, that's for sure. And they treated us really great. The thing that was interesting for me was just seeing, where a rock band at that point could go, and seeing Soundgarden sort of on its way up and going out on that tour and realizing this is one of the possible scenarios of where we could go, and we all just kind of looked at each other and thought, I don't think this is us. And so in that way it was helpful.
That you didn't want to have big inflatable things at a Soundgarden show?
No, probably not. It didn't really just didn't fit the band. And the weird Axl stories, it almost has more to do with the people that were like his handlers or his management or people that surrounded him that would kind of try to keep him from knowing about things, and would worry about how he would respond to stuff in that way, and that sort of ridiculous kind of rock world way, things that we all make fun of to this day. That was the weirder part. It was the way people treated him, and the things they wouldn't do or wouldn't say to him that were the weirdest part of it.
It's like a living Spinal Tap. The movie is still apropos this many years later.
Yeah, and the first day there were long sort of catwalks on the stage. And it was an enormous aluminum stage, and there were 3 of these long catwalks that went out into the audience. And they told me, there are teleprompters at the end of each one. That's where lyrics are scrolled, and also you're not allowed to go on them ever. You can't touch the prompters, but you can't even walk out on the catwalks. And I thought, well, really, if we don't go out on these, we're never even going to see a person in the audience, because it was like 40 feet away. And I thought it was silly, so the very first song of the very first show we opened, I went out onto each one, decidedly, couldn't really even hear what was going on behind me, and stood on the prompter, and then walked back and went to the middle one and went out there and just kind of marked my territory like, guess who's going to go out and do this whenever I want. And they were fine with it, but then I realized that these are like weird rules that management came up with. It had nothing to do with anyone else, and that happens when a band gets really big. You have to be careful of what's happening around you, because people will make decisions for you or present you to other people in a way that you're not.
That does it for today's episode, guys. Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit the like button and subscribe. And as always, guys, go check out GNRCentral.com for the latest Guns N' Roses news. Take care.